His car was towed from the parking lot because of the red MAGA hat he wore with pride. The manager, confident in his judgment, decided to humiliate the undesirable client, unaware that he was dealing with the state governor. The twist in this story left even the loudest critics speechless. The scorching Florida sun shone brightly over the bustling shopping center, where Dan Griffin, a 50-year-old man with a confident demeanor, parked his massive pickup truck. Dressed in jeans and a plaid shirt, he looked like a typical Southerner, but what stood out most was the red MAGA hat perched on his head, a symbol that had long sparked polarized reactions. To Dan, it wasn't just an accessory, it was a proud declaration of his beliefs and love for his country. Dan was heading to a hardware store when he noticed a young man approaching his truck with a hostile expression. The man was Tom Martin, the parking lot manager, and it was clear that he didn't take kindly to Dan's appearance, or, more specifically, his hat. Tom, in his early 30s, was the epitome of the new wave. A self-proclaimed social justice warrior, an activist at heart, and overly zealous in his job. He prided himself on being the enforcer of moral order. Spotting the truck adorned with MAGA symbolism, Tom felt it was his duty to act. "No place for that here," he muttered to himself as he approached the vehicle. Grabbing his radio, Tom called for a tow truck, determined to remove the offender without delay. When Dan returned to his truck, holding several bags of tools, he saw that a tow truck was already attaching cables to his vehicle. "Excuse me, this is my truck. What's going on?" Dan asked, his tone calm but tinged with surprise. Tom straightened up, crossing his arms in a posture of superiority, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "You're parked incorrectly, sir. Your vehicle is obstructing traffic. We're towing it," Tom said, his voice loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. Dan glanced at the parking spot, noting that his truck was parked perfectly between the lines. "Really? Looks to me like it's parked just fine," Dan replied, still composed. "That's irrelevant," Tom snapped, noticing that bystanders had started to gather. "Rules are rules. We can't allow symbols like that to provoke people." Some passers-by paused to watch, murmuring amongst themselves as the conflict unfolded. Dan, unwilling to escalate the situation, stepped back and said in a measured tone, "Well, go ahead then. But perhaps you'd like to double-check your decision first." His voice was calm, almost friendly, which only fueled Tom's frustration. Tom scowled. He didn't like this confident, unbothered man who refused to rise to the bait. "I don't need to explain myself," Tom retorted, raising his voice unnecessarily. "This is private property, and I make the rules here." Dan chuckled softly as he noticed the crowd growing, with some onlookers already recording the scene on their phones. "Your prerogative," Dan said, adjusting his hat snugly on his head. "Just remember, every action has its consequences." Tom's face flushed red with anger as he gestured for the tow truck operator to hurry up. As the tow truck began pulling away with Dan's pickup, Dan turned to the crowd and joked, "Quite the show, huh? Anyone know where I can find a good cup of coffee around here?" The remark elicited a few chuckles from the audience while Tom clenched his fists in silent rage. He's going to regret this, Tom thought, oblivious to the fact that he was setting himself up for his own humiliation. Dan stood calmly at the edge of the parking lot, watching his truck being hauled away. The crowd buzzed with whispers and speculation, many pulling out their phones to record the spectacle. "This is outrageous. He didn't do anything wrong," murmured one bystander. Another chimed in, "Serves him right. You can't just flaunt stuff like that here." The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Emboldened by the growing attention, Tom seemed to bask in the crowd's gaze. His confidence swelled, and he decided that towing the truck wasn't enough. He needed to make an example of Dan. "You clearly don't care how your actions affect those around you," Tom announced loudly, turning to address the crowd. "Symbols like that one spread hatred and division. As a community, we can't stand for it." Dan smirked subtly, but said nothing. Slowly, he removed his hat, dusted off an invisible speck, and placed it back on his head. "It's just a hat," he said quietly but firmly, speaking more to the crowd than to Tom. "The truck doesn't matter. What matters is principle." The statement sent a ripple through the onlookers. A few nodded in agreement, appreciating Dan's composed response. A young woman in the crowd shouted, "Leave him alone! He's not hurting anyone!" But Tom, growing increasingly agitated, saw this as a personal battle. "Principle?" he shouted, his voice rising. "People like you always hide behind words like that to justify your behavior. We're not here to accommodate your selfish views." The crowd began to split into factions. Some sided with Tom, while others showed growing sympathy for Dan. Heated arguments broke out among the spectators, adding to the commotion. Dan remained steadfast, his patience seemingly infinite. Rather than respond, he adjusted his hat again and fixed his gaze on Tom. "Sometimes," Dan said softly, "people get so busy trying to hurt others, they don't realize they're digging their own graves." The quiet remark, delivered with unshakable confidence, left Tom visibly unsettled. His face flushed a deeper red, and he stepped forward as if preparing to retort but hesitated. From the back of the crowd, someone shouted, "Hey, manager, what if he's right? What will you do then?" The question seemed to unnerve Tom. He turned to the crowd and attempted a sarcastic retort. "If he's right? Ha! Trust me, he's not." But there was a tremor in his voice now, a flicker of doubt. Meanwhile, Dan calmly pulled out his phone and began typing something. The crowd watched intently, their curiosity piqued. "Think he's calling the cops?" someone whispered. "Or a lawyer," another speculated. Tom, struggling to maintain his composure, raised his voice again. "Let him call whoever he wants. This is my parking lot, and I make the rules here." Despite his bluster, his unease was apparent. The crowd, sensing the tide turning, started to disperse, but the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew this wasn't over. As the spectators thinned out, one passerby approached Dan and said quietly, "Sir, it's a pleasure watching you handle this. Staying calm is your superpower." Dan smiled in return. "Thank you. Calm always beats noise." With that, he turned and strolled toward the shopping center, leaving Tom stewing in anger, and perhaps beginning to sense the storm brewing in his own direction. The next morning, Tom woke up in a good mood, flipping through the pages of the local newspaper with a satisfied grin. His triumph from the previous day still warmed his soul. He saw himself as a true enforcer of order. Sitting in his parking lot office, he sipped his coffee and occasionally glanced out the window at the bustling activity outside. But the day was about to take an unexpected turn. Around noon, the office door opened, and a young man in a sharp suit walked in, carrying a folder under his arm. His demeanor was professional, with the air of someone accustomed to structure and efficiency. "Are you Mr. Martin?" the man asked, his tone polite yet authoritative. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" Tom replied, straightening up, sensing this was someone important. "I represent the new owner of this complex. He would like to personally inspect operations here and will be arriving in a few minutes," the man explained. The mention of a new owner made Tom's heart skip a beat, but he quickly brushed off his unease. It's probably just a routine check, he thought, confident in his management skills. He even allowed himself a smirk, imagining how he would impress the new boss with tales of his strict yet fair approach. After the man left, Tom adjusted his tie and smoothed his shirt, preparing for the visit. But when the door opened again and the owner walked in, Tom froze. Standing in the doorway, impeccably dressed and exuding quiet authority, was Dan, the same man in the MAGA hat whose truck Tom had proudly towed the previous day. The hat was gone, but Dan's confident posture and faint smile remained. "Good afternoon, Tom," Dan said as he removed his dark sunglasses and casually placed them on the desk. "Shall we discuss your approach to customer service?" A chill ran down Tom's spine. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "This must be some sort of misunderstanding," Tom stammered, his voice barely audible. "Oh, it's definitely a misunderstanding," Dan replied, his tone calm but cutting. "For instance, you seem to have misunderstood your role here. Let me refresh your memory. Your job is to serve all customers equally, not let your personal biases dictate your actions." Dan sat down across from Tom, his gaze steady. "Need me to jog your memory about yesterday? Or is remembering not your strong suit?" he added, his voice sharp yet composed. Tom took a deep breath, scrambling for an explanation. The silence in the room was suffocating. A few staff members who had peeked inside quickly retreated, sensing the tension. I didn't know who you were," Tom began, his words stumbling over each other. Dan interrupted, his tone unwavering. "That's where you're wrong. The mistake wasn't in not knowing who I am. The mistake was allowing your prejudices to guide your behavior." The silence that followed was deafening. In the hallway, someone clumsily dropped a folder, the sound echoing in the tense air. "You have a choice," Dan continued. "Prove that you're capable of treating people with respect, regardless of your personal views. To do that, you'll attend a training program on customer service and bias awareness. If something like this happens again, your career here will end." "Yes, sir, of course, sir," Tom mumbled, nervously wringing his hands. Dan stood, slowly picking up his sunglasses and looking Tom directly in the eyes. "This is your one chance, Tom. Make the most of it or don't. That's up to you. Good luck." Without waiting for a response, Dan turned and walked out, leaving Tom sitting in stunned silence. One of Tom's colleagues cautiously poked their head into the office and whispered, "You okay?" Tom nodded wordlessly, feeling the weight of his own mistake settle heavily on his shoulders. The lobby of the office building had become the center of attention. Employees, clients, and even passers-by stopped by the glass doors trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. Tom stood pale and unsteady, barely able to keep his footing. The murmurs of the crowd buzzed around him, some discreetly recording on their phones, others openly discussing how far the conflict had gone. Dan stood a few steps away, holding his red MAGA hat in his hand. The hat's vibrant color seemed even brighter under the cold fluorescent lights of the lobby. A faint smile played on Dan's lips, but his voice carried an unmistakable firmness. "Tom," Dan began, pausing to let the room fall silent. "Mistakes happen. We're all human. But here," he glanced around the room, ensuring everyone was listening, "the mistake wasn't in what you did. It was in your attitude." The crowd held its breath. Tom opened his mouth to respond, but the only sound he managed was a weak, "I didn't know." "Yes, you did," Dan interrupted firmly. "You knew my truck was parked correctly. You knew I hadn't broken any rules, but you decided that your opinion mattered more than the facts. That was your mistake." Someone in the crowd called out, "Well said." The room fell silent again. Tom dropped his head, his face flushed with shame. Meanwhile, the story had already taken off on social media. Videos of the previous day's incident had gone viral, sparking heated debates online. Comments flooded in, praising Dan's composure and criticizing Tom's actions. By the end of the day, the parking company released an official statement. We condemn any form of discrimination and fully support the right to free expression. Measures are being taken to ensure incidents like this never happen again." The next morning, Dan met with the company's executives to discuss the situation. They offered to fire Tom immediately, but Dan refused. Firing him would be the easy way out, Dan explained. Giving him a chance to learn and improve, that's harder. If he learns from this, he could become a better leader. Tom was sent to mandatory training on conflict resolution and customer service. When he returned to work, he was a changed man, more polite, more attentive, and, most importantly, free of his former prejudices. On Tom's last day of training, Dan approached him. "You know, Tom," Dan said, placing his iconic MAGA hat back on his head, "life has a funny way of teaching us lessons we didn't expect. The key is learning from them." Tom nodded solemnly, his gratitude apparent. As Dan turned to leave, the room broke into applause. One of the employees shouted, "Way to go, Dan!" Outside, reporters waited by the doors, capturing the moment as Dan exited the building, smiling with his MAGA hat perfectly in place. A journalist called out, "Dan, how do you feel after all of this?" Dan paused thoughtfully before replying, "Some things in life are more important than a truck, like how we treat each other." His words spread quickly, quoted across social media and news outlets. The story ended on a high note. Justice was served, Tom got a chance to grow, and Dan earned respect and admiration nationwide.